We'll just dive in.
Perfect.
All right. Well, thanks once again for joining me at Pastor's Positive Mental Health Institute here with another wonderful guest. And I can't wait for you to meet Stacey as she's going to share some wonderful work that she is doing with Run Hard, Rest Well. I'll let her talk more about it because she's more of an expert on that than I am. But she's doing great work for the church. And if you like what the content that you have see here, please like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss any riveting updates of content. So anyway, without prolonging the introduction, Stacey, please kind of introduce yourself. Tell us about how you came into the ministry that you're doing now, and then tell us about Run Hard, Rest Well, please.
Absolutely. Well, Kirk, first of all, Kirk, thank you so much for having me. I love what you do, and I just think that we need to support our pastors in every way we can, and I love your podcast. So thank you so much. So again, I'm Stacey Dumbacher. I'm the director of programs with Run Hard, Rest Well. And a little bit about me, I'm married to a wonderful guy named Bill for 26 years, and I still like him. So I think we're going to be okay, right? And have worked for Run Hard, Rest Well for about 5 years, and very passionate about what I do. I feel so blessed to do something that I love. And the reason I love working with Run Hard, Rest Well is it really changed my life. So I heard the message of restorative wellness about 10 years ago at a time in my life when I was overloaded and exhausted and was really responding in ways that I wasn't super proud of, right? Because I was just so overloaded. And I heard this message of restorative wellness and how Sabbath is essential and stillness and solitude can fill up your bucket so you can be your best. And I really began to start applying those concepts. And honestly, Kirk, it changed my life. It changed my family's lives. And we are people who live with much more peace than we did before. And so I was asked to join the Run Hard, Rest Well team 5 years ago, and I love it. So let me tell you a little bit about Run Hard, Rest Well and what we do. Yeah. So we are passionate about teaching individuals and organizations about something called restorative wellness. Okay, so this is kind of how it works. We all know how to run really hard, right? We all know how to strive, to perform, to achieve. All in the name of Jesus for our congregations and for our families, right? And that's important work. But we do not know how to rest well. Resting well is learning to rest in a way that really refills our buckets, right? Because all day long we pour and we pour and we pour into plans, projects, and people until eventually we have nothing left. And we're called to give our lives away. There's nothing wrong with that, right? Right. But we are equally called to rest. And that's the piece I think as believers, we often kind of gloss over and we try to do all of this service on our own. When really God designed us for our service to be an overflow of what he gave us, right? So Run Hard, Rest Well champions restorative wellness that kind of revolutionizes God's work in us and through us. It reacquaints us with this peace and quiet in our souls that we've tried to live without. And Run Hard, Rest Well really comes alongside organizations, churches, nonprofits, businesses, and schools. And we come alongside them and we look at changing the culture because most wellness programs kind of focus on individuals. But the reality is we need to focus on organizations, on groups of people, because we actually learn better neurologically when we learn in a group, because we can process and hear other people's perspectives. And so that's super important. And so we come alongside them and talk about restorative wellness, which has 4 rhythms: sleep, Sabbath, stillness, and solitude. And we do that with a really interactive learning model. We do that to kind of create this healthy norm of respecting working really hard, but also respecting resting well. So that's Run Hard, Rest Well.
Yeah, no, that's great. I'll have information in the comment section so people can just click on the link and check you out and see what kind of things you offer. It's interesting. As you were talking, you remind me of years ago, we have a good friend who's become a fairly successful author, and she she and her family just took what was called, and her book's called Radical Sabbatical. Joanne Craft is her name. And they took a year off of everything. And just kind of that whole idea was we're so busy. We just need to focus on being a family and being who we are. And so it was just a great, actually, she ended up going on some book tour with Max Lucado and stuff like that. But so good friend of ours. So there you go, Joanne. If you listen to this, I plugged your book for you. Anyway, so but it's one of those things. As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking of organizations, and pastors fall into this, and church workers fall into this, and we'll talk about pastors' wives in a moment. But what happens is that pastors kind of feel like we have to show our value or earn our value by how hard we work so that the congregation doesn't feel like we're being lazy. And often what happens is, and some of it is that usually pastors are driven a little bit that way anyway. It just feeds that almost workaholic mentality, to use that term. But the challenge is when you're talking about organizationally, if that's the way the pastor's running, and then that's the expectation that people come in to come alongside in the ministry as lay people or what, that I've got to run that way. And then we all find that rest is devalued. And it's interesting, you did say something that about solitude. And I think it's important for us to understand, and maybe you can speak to this briefly, that solitude is different than isolation. And so, because I think a lot of times pastors think, well, if I get away for solitude, then I'm isolating myself from everybody else. But Jesus took time for solitude. And even he was so solitude, if you want to call it that, they had to go find him. Where are you? And he valued that. So when you get to that solitude piece, I don't know if you could speak to that a little bit about how that's important, if you could just take a moment for that.
Absolutely. So I think there's a big difference between isolation and solitude. Isolation is a lack of, right? A lack of connection, a lack of relationship. Solitude is a choice to pull away, right? Solitude is allowing yourself to be by yourself in a peaceful place. It is about taking some time to really connect with the God who absolutely loves you, who created you, who knows you. And in solitude, it actually gives space to really enhance that connection. So when I first started working on the 4 rhythms of rest, solitude was the last one I worked on because honestly, it didn't sound fun, right? But then I went into my first time of solitude, intentional solitude. I brought a journal, I brought my Bible, I brought my walking shoes, and I brought a really good book. And I went into those 4 hours, and the first 45 minutes, Kirk, was like I had to do a brain dump of all of the things that were in my head that I was supposed to be doing instead of doing solitude. And I did this dump, and as I wrote everything down, and I thought I can do it later, I wrote it down, there was this settling in my spirit like I had never experienced. And I've been a Christian since I've been 9, right? Since I was 9. And I knew that God loved me in my head. But it was in solitude at age 42 that God put it in my heart that I am incredibly loved right now, today, for no other reason except the fact that I'm me. And it's in that time of solitude where God can really speak, because so often we go so fast, we can't even hear him.
Yeah.
Did that answer your question?
No, absolutely. And I think that's important for, not only every believer, but especially for pastors and church workers who even when we get to have time alone, we call it alone solitude, we're busy planning the next thing, or thinking about a conversation we had earlier or past week or whatnot. And so we look at those solitude times as not what you just described. We look at it as, oh, great, it's a good planning session for me. And that's hard because so there's a little booklet, I can't remember when it was written, by Charles Hummel years ago, called Tyranny of the Urgent. And it's basically kind of what you talked about, how we are just so busy, and the reality is not everything is as much of a priority. as we tend to make it. And I had one pastor friend years ago said, we're not really busy. We just fill our schedules.
I love
And I'm
that.
like, that's really true. We say, oh, we're so busy. Well, why are you busy? Because you've made choices to fill your schedule. And so the intentionality of solitude is, I think, some of the challenge, and maybe you can, if you don't mind going down this road for a minute, but the challenge for solitude, I think, especially in the ministry, is how do you set boundaries to protect that time? Because there's got to be a specific and intentional work to say, no, this is protected time. So can you give maybe a couple tips on how we can learn how to do that a little better?
Absolutely. And actually, I have a whole section on this
Great.
a little bit later, but I'm going to bump it up because this is something I'm really passionate about. Number one, Kirk, you hit on it earlier. As pastors and leaders, everyone is watching them, right? And there's a hardness in that, but there's also a beauty in that because God equipped pastors to lead. But if they're only seeing the work of the pastor, they're missing out. They need to also see the rest of the pastor, and setting healthy boundaries is so important. And so there's a couple areas I think it's important to set boundaries in for pastors. And this is the thing, we as congregation members have got to respect those boundaries, and leaders within the church that support that pastor need to protect that pastor, right? And so number one is I think that pastors need to realistically say, on an average week, how much time can I give? Now, there's always going to be an exception, right? But that exception shouldn't be every week.
Right.
And then they need to set that schedule that says, in general, these are the hours I'm working, unless there's a big need that arises that someone else cannot handle. That's a key, right? Because so many times pastors think they need to be all things for all people. And the reality is they're uniquely and wonderfully gifted, but they don't have all the gifts.
Right.
And we as a body are called to use our gifts to support the pastor's work, to support God's work, right? So number one, I think you have to look at on a weekly basis, how many hours can I give? Because if you don't, and that sounds kind of rigid, like, well, they're a pastor, they need to meet needs. Absolutely. But they are also a spouse, a father, a son or daughter, a friend, an aunt or an uncle. And those roles are also important, and they will stand before God on those roles as well, not just the pastor. So that's number one. Number two is they need to have a sabbatical, period, weekly. And like my pastor does a really good job with boundaries. I respect Brian Cochran so much because he's really good with boundaries. And Mondays are his sabbatical. And during that time, I know if I call him, I won't hear back that day. And that's a good thing, right? And so have boundaries around that sabbatical. And if you're a pastor out there and you're currently not taking a sabbatical, start with just 3 hours and then grow into a whole day. Sometimes we go, oh, just jump in. That's scary, right? So start with just 3 hours and then intentionally grow and do it with your family. That's another thing, is that the entire family of a pastor needs that sabbatical. All of us do, but I think so often with the work that gets pushed aside. And then I think the third thing in regard to boundaries is just be able to develop a team that can do other things. Because again, pastors don't need to be all things for all people, right? They need to lead, and they need to lead well in a way that is honoring. But they don't need to visit everybody in the hospital. They don't need to make sure every new person gets a personal call. There are all kinds of people with unique giftings that can do that.
Yeah. Well, and I think, if we don't do that as pastors, we unintentionally create almost an idol of ourselves for the people, because they're depending upon us more than the Lord sometimes, and how the Lord can use other people. And, it's interesting. It's one of those challenges that we have. One of the previous podcast with Pastor Greg Griffiths, he said, he goes, I'm not the guy to visit you in the hospital. I have someone who will go and sit with you in the hospital, and they'll spend hours with you. He goes, I just can't do that, but I know that I can't. So he goes, I make sure I have people who can. And I think that that's an important thing for us to do. And the other thing I'd like to mention too is that pastors typically struggle having or giving themselves over to any sort of extracurricular activity or what I would call a hobby. And so what happens is when they get to retirement age, their identity is so wrapped up in being needed and serving the church that they go into a lot of depression, or they just can't, so they don't retire or they die in the pulpit because they don't have any sort of so I always encourage pastors to what I would say, spend playtime with your congregation too. In fact, today in a couple hours, I'm going golfing with two of the elders at my church, and we're just going to hang out. We don't talk about, I mean, we might talk about ministry a little bit, but I love just hanging out with people in the church, and I think it's important when pastors are saying, "Hey, we can enjoy life." It doesn't have to always be about how are we, planning the next thing? How are we growing the church? How are we discipling? It shouldn't be that. In fact, I think a lot of times we see Jesus just hanging out with people. And that's true discipleship to me, is you hang out with people and share life with them. And the Lord is just part of everyday life and everything that you do. So that's really good. So we're talking about obviously taking sabbatical and taking rest. And I think we've kind of answered this question, but I want to know if there's anything else you can speak to it of what are some challenges that you're seeing facing pastors and church leaders right now?
Absolutely. So I am not a pastor, but I work, I know a lot of pastors, and then I also coach multiple pastors. And I think one of the things that I see consistently is that they have a really hard time spending time in the Word for them. It is always, oh, this will make a great point here. This will make a great point here. And I know that that's naturally how they're wired, right? That's what makes them good at teaching. But at the same time, we are called first and foremost to have a personal, authentic, real, growing relationship with the Lord. And I think so often as pastors dig into the Word, it is about teaching. And I really think that can be so exhausting after a while, because the Lord wants us to spend time in His presence and in His Word so He can, so we can enjoy Him. So He can speak incredible love into our heart. So we can assess what's going on inside of us. And having Sabbath or solitude or stillness are spaces where as pastors, they can come and not have to look at the Word through a lens of teaching, but a lens of, God, what do you have for me today? What do you want to speak to my heart to breathe life into my soul today? And I just think that's so incredibly important. And and then one more thing that I see consistently where pastors really struggle is that the demands of the job take a precedent over family, and a spouse is left to do the majority of the work. And I think that that's a really hard situation. And I see that very consistently with pastors. So those are the two additional ones I would probably add to that.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. It's one of those things that you always sit there as a pastor and you say, I feel like I'm reading the Bible for other people all the time. I mean, that's just, and so it really is a hard discipline to, because I mean, most of us before we were pastors just love sitting down and reading God's Word. And that's some of the, how God used that time to prompt us to respond to the calling to be a pastor or a church worker. And we kind of leave that aside. He goes, oh, I've already done that. Instead of saying, wait a second, this is still my life and I need it more than anything. And you mentioned spouses. So I was in a denomination years ago where the pastor's wife was kind of expected to head the women's ministry, speak at conferences, kind of make sure. And so my wife and I was an assistant pastor in that denomination for several years. And then my wife and I decided to plant a church. And she said to me, she goes, so what's your expectation of me? And I just said to her, I said, I just would like you to be my wife. If you want to do something, we'll talk about it and I'll support it. But I saw that pressure, and some pastors' wives were incredibly gifted at that. But I found it to be almost what I would call an imbalance of ministry, to where you had almost a power couple running everything in the church, and it tended to be unhealthy to some degree. And so but so we have that. We have the expectation of pastors' wives that I think can be overwhelming. We have what you just mentioned, that pastors' wives and families kind of get ignored, which is and again, that denomination I was in previously, it was kind of like, no, the Lord comes first before even your family. And yeah, I agree with that in theory, right? But if I can't minister my family correctly in a godly way, I have no business ministering and helping the family of God. And Paul is pretty specific about that in his writings. And so I think that we just have to, what's our first ministry is to our family. How do I honor God with my family? So what are how do you see, so I would like some, if you could give some specifics of what are you seeing is happening with pastors spouses and church worker spouses in the church today?
Absolutely. And Kirk, I'm super excited to talk about this.
Yeah.
Because about 7 years ago, I was asked, so I worked for 100 Restwell for 5 years officially, but I actually spoke for them for a couple of years before that as a fill-in speaker, right? And so I was asked to go and speak to spouses of pastors about 7 years ago. And I have multiple friends who are, for them, I think they're all pastors' wives, right? But it could go either way. And in this group was both men and women as spouses of pastors. And so I called my friends and I said, hey, I'm getting ready to go and talk. And I said, what would you say are the hardest things for you? And Kirk, I began to just cry with them. And it broke my heart because they were the loneliest people I've ever talked to. And what they had talked about is the fact that they really felt like they couldn't be real because they didn't grow real about what was going on in their family, because they didn't want their spouse, the pastor, to look bad, right? And then that led to this huge amount of isolation. And many of them talked about congregation assuming the 2-for-1 rule, right? So I love the fact that you gave your wife this gift of like, just be my wife. And then if you feel like doing something else, go for it. And I think almost every person I talked to actually mentioned that as well, and how that was really stressful. Really proud of my best friend who is a pastor's wife, and they have a special needs child. And she just basically said, you know what? I have my hands full at home and I can't wait to be part of the congregation, but I can't take on this in this ministry, which she was asked to do. And I was just really proud of her for doing that. I think the other thing that I heard consistently and see is that pastors' wives often have the experience of people not being really authentic with them because they feel like they have to be perfect because it's the pastor's wife. And so they don't share their good, bad, and ugly, right? We all have good, bad, and ugly, right? Either you're the pastor, the pastor's wife, or whoever. And so they really just longed for authentic relationships. And what I've seen in congregations is that everybody else thinks that someone else is meeting the needs of the pastor's family. And often they are ignored. And I spoke at a big women's retreat last October. And I spoke about the fact that it was 120 women. And I said, women, if you have a pastor's wife that you know, you need to attend to them. You need to love them well. You need to give them a safe place where they can be honest about what happens at home. And I had multiple pastors' wives come up to me and say, Stacey, thank you. You have no clue how lonely I am. Right?
Yeah. No, that's really good. I think your point about how everyone assumes somebody else is doing it is just spot on. And one of the things that I try to do in the work that I do is to create an awareness, especially for church members, to go, wait a second, don't assume that somebody is doing it. And just because you think somebody's doing it doesn't get you off the hook. I think that we all, as a part of the body of Christ, are responsible to care for one another. And as pastors and church leaders, in our denomination that I'm in right now, we're patriarchal, but church workers, we have directors of Christian education that are both male and female, and so the spouses of those people, those church leaders often get left behind for the ministry because, a lot of times director of Christian education is youth and family. Well, when you're doing youth work and children's ministry, you're not having normal hours. And so having that rhythm to where, and then the pastor often, I'll pick on myself, I guess, expects you to work the normal hours, but then also do the other hours. I was in a church where I was an assistant and I was doing music, and I had over 100 people involved in music and different practices, and I did a lot of study with them. And so everything that I did was until 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night. And for like 4 days out of the week, and yet I was expected to be there at 7:30 the next day, it was one of the seasons that actually got me into what I'm doing now. Is the Lord's like, this is not good. How do we change this? And so I think that one of the thing I'd like to ask you is, what are just some practical strategies? So obviously you mentioned, hey, create a space for pastors' wives and church workers. But what are some other strategies that maybe you encourage or have seen successful where they can really care for the family of pastors?
Yeah. So I do want to, before I answer this, can I go back to the other
Absolutely.
question of like, what are the challenges? I think it's really important that because I am also a youth leader and I dig teens. Man, if I could spend time with anybody, it's teens, right? And I really believe there's some specific challenges for teens that I think need to be talked about. And that is the fact that so often leaders and pastors' kids are expected to be perfect, mine included, because I'm a leader within my church. Mine included. And so, and I've even had multiple kids say to me, my parents have said, don't make stupid choices because then I look bad. And that is such a toxic perspective. And for a teenager, they're learning how to make good choices, right? And so they need to be allowed to mess up in a grace-filled place. Because if not, and they feel like they have to be perfect all the time, eventually that will crash. I've seen it again and again. Right. And so I just think that that's one of the challenges I think for families as well, is that pressure that's put on teens to be perfect. So to now answer your question, if I can, we good with that?
Awesome. Yeah, no, I think it's great. Go for it.
How can church members help the spouses and pastors and families, I have to add?
Yeah,
so number one, invite your pastor's spouse into relationship. Invite them for coffee, invite them for a ladies or a guy's night out, have them over for dinner, and be authentic with them. Don't try to act perfect and be perfect, because they are not perfect, right? And just enjoy being with them as a friend. Also, don't, as you bring people, pastors into your congregation, don't assume that the spouse is going to have a specific role. Give them the freedom to use the gifts that they have in the way God is directing them, not to fill a need. That's another one. Definitely create that safe space. And I want to speak about what a safe space is, because that's so important. A safe space is where somebody can be honest about what is going on in a loving way without being worried about anybody else knowing. And that includes prayer requests, right? You should not be requesting prayer for your pastor's spouse without their approval.
Yeah.
Right. And that's so incredibly important. And I think that's kind of a way that some of us get around that. Another huge one, I believe, is when the church is dealing with an issue, okay, check in with the pastor's spouses, because they may not be directly involved in that conflict or that decision or that situation, but I guarantee you that the pastor is bringing that stress home to some level, and that's impacting their family. So come alongside them during those difficult times, just like people come alongside the pastor. Come alongside the families and support them.
Wow, that's so good. It is one of those things that I feel like especially my spouse takes more of the spiritual attack of the ministry than I do. And I see it, and when she sees it affecting me, it affects her more than it really does me. And so that's just good, solid advice to say, hey, let's really care for them too. And it's one of those things that's interesting when you talk about friendship. Pastors are weird, and church workers maybe still there's still a separation, I think, and it's one of the things when I give seminars to pastors, I wait to talk about being friends because it's part of positive mental health, interpersonal relationship skills, and that's the ability to create lasting friendships. And one of the things that's interesting is there's a great resistance. I would say with a certain age demographic, it's greater than maybe younger people, but there's just a challenge, and some of it's because they've been hurt, and some of it is because of what they've been taught, for pastors to actually feel like they can be friends with church members. And the way I approach it is, well, my wife is my wife, but I'm also her pastor. So, that's a weird relationship too. So what does that look like? And so you can do that. And one of the challenges that I find, and you mentioned it so great, so perfectly, and I love that, is when you have the pastor over, just have them over as a person. Have their family over as people. Don't, and if pastors can go to a place, and it doesn't have to be every person in the congregation, we understand that, but if they can go to a place where they can just kind of, if I had hair, I'd let my hair down, right? We can just relax and shoot the breeze, not talk just about ministry the whole time. It's one of those things when I did my research. The pastors, when they first get invited to someone's house, their first thought is, okay, what's the agenda? And
Wow.
so the second invite is actually way more important than the first invite. And so that's it because, oh, I went once, there was no agenda. Oh, now I can't wait to go again because I'm not on guard the whole time. And so that's just my 2 cents about that.
Yeah.
Look for things. And it's another thing that is look for things that pastors and their families are interested in. How can I support that? How can I get involved in that? Maybe I'm interested in that too. We could share that. And so what would be the one thing that you would say is the greatest need for, let's just talk about right now, spouses of pastors. What do you see as the greatest need for spouses of pastors and church leaders? Because I don't want to leave out, church leaders and church workers' spouses in there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would just say authentic relationships. So many of our needs are met through we are created to be relational. And there's all kinds of studies that look at how people respond to trial and stress when they're alone versus how they respond to trial and stress within the community. And again, every test shows if you are in community, you are going to recover quicker and better. And so I just think to have an authentic, real community, because that's going to fill so many of the other needs that are there.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think that it's challenging for pastors, their spouses, their families, and church workers to engage in that authenticity. So what can you say to pastors and church workers and spouses that can help them actually be willing to engage in authentic relationship?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say, to be willing to say that you have a need. Be willing to admit that you have a need, whether it's within your family or just personally, because when we get to serve one another, that begins a bond that is beautiful. And then you can grow with that bond and be willing. I would just say, just start with a little, just show them a little bit of hard and just see if they respond in a way that fills you up. Right. And I think the other thing too, that I would want to say to them is, begin to take small steps into deeper relationships and don't be afraid to say, ooh, that person doesn't feel safe to me. So I need to find maybe a couple other people to fill that need. Because we have this gut feeling, right? Gibbs from NCIS, the gut, right?
Mhm.
About is a person safe or not? And don't be afraid to listen to that. But also, if you find someone that you don't feel safe with, that's not a nobody's safe. That is maybe there's other people that you can connect with as well. But I think it has to start with them being willing to say, I have a need. right? And hopefully the congregation is coming to them and it's kind of a two-way street, right? Like that's ideal. But being willing to say you have a need and can someone else help me meet it is a wonderful place to start.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think that, because you mentioned that when we spoke, a lot of the spouses were like, we feel alone. We don't feel like we have any support. So I think recognizing the need is really important. But also, I wonder if you could speak to this. I find that expectation of relationship with church members can often be let me see if I can phrase it. We want that authenticity. Families want that, but there seems to be a point where it just, and this has been my experience, and I think my wife's experience. You get to a point, and then it just can't seem to go any further. Maybe because, and I'm just going to process this with you for a minute. Maybe because our viewpoint of life in the ministry is, I'm going to call it this, more ministry focused all the time than maybe somebody who is just a church member, who loves the church, loves the pastor's family. And so I find that sometimes there seems to be maybe an improper expectation on myself and maybe family members that there's going to be a depth of relationship that is going to just fulfill all these wonderful needs, but there seems to be, and maybe you've experienced this, just a point where okay, this is as far as the relationship is going to really go, and I have to be okay with that. And not that they're unsafe, but some of the deeper things maybe that we need to talk about, and maybe that's our hesitancy as church leaders, that we just can't be that vulnerable or something like that. But maybe you could speak to maybe some limitations that there might be to those friendships.
Mhm. I think, first of all, we have to look at that friendships overall. There is always important to have friends that are in the same space as you are, who kind of get your struggles. But I firmly believe it is equally important to have people that are not in your space, people that might give a different perspective, people that don't agree with you, people that cannot understand, right? We actually need both. Because you're right, there are certain things I will never be able to understand. The feelings and the concerns of a pastor, because I'm not married to a pastor and I am not a pastor, right? And so I think acknowledging that there are limitations in some relationships is important. Yeah. And to be able to say, this person is wonderful and I appreciate their gifts, but I've gone as deep as I can. And that's in anybody's lives. Well, number one is we can only maintain so many deep relationships.
Good point.
Right?
Yeah.
But I think another thing is that we as a congregation member need to hear people in leadership's hearts and need to have good, healthy, authentic conversations that start like this. Kirk, that's really hard. I don't understand all of what goes into that. Could you unpack it for me? Because I really want to walk this journey with you. And being able to say, I often feel like people outside the church can't understand this because there's so many details to it. Do you want to do a deep dive? And can I share that with you? And that request coming from both ends is really important, because it's amazing when we do that, how somebody outside the situation, where that situation is not the norm, can really speak some truth into that, right? They can really speak some truth into that. And so, yes, I believe there are some limitations, but I think sometimes pushing through those limitations is the healthiest thing you can do if they're safe relationships.
Yeah.
I went to, I'm part of the building zoning group in my town, and I'm the new one. Everybody else has been on this panel for at least 6 years, and we had this conflict a couple weeks ago, and I asked the stupidly obvious question, like, why can't these two departments just work together? And everybody was like, oh, right? So like somebody outside came in and looked at the obvious things they were missing And it was an aha moment.
Yeah.
And I think that that can happen in personal relationships as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'd also like to encourage pastors and church workers and their families, just because you've been hurt in the past, because you've led with your heart. Don't stop leading with your heart. It's still what we need to do. So that's really, really good. So and another thing too, you kind of talked about pastors' kids. And one of the things that I have seen is sometimes pastors have actually, unfortunately, been run out of a church because their kids were so misbehaved, I should say, or not. And again, sometimes that's just an unfair expectation that they have on pastors' kids. But what would you say to ministry leaders that have a family? To what would the expectation, I hate that term sometimes, but anyway, but what would the expectation for their kids be if you were to speak to a pastor, a family, and church worker? What would you say to them about their kids?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Kirk, I want to thank you for giving me a little bit of insight, because I've never heard of a pastor being run out because of struggles of their kids. And that's something that's really good for me to learn and to hear as I speak about this. So thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate that piece of information. And it's so sad. That breaks my heart. So I would say for pastors and leaders, don't put that expectation on your kids. Like, make a decision not to go there. Set the expectation with your kids that they are learning and they will not always make the perfect choices, but to tell them our job is to take those broken choices and put them before the Lord, to make them right, and to learn from them. And almost give them permission to fail, because the reality is all of us do. It's inevitable, right? And then from a congregation's perspective, and I am telling you, this is huge. So if you're in a congregation, please hear me. When teens make a mistake, do not just sit back and judge their mistake or judge their parents. That is not helpful for absolutely anyone. If a teen is struggling, choose to invest in that teen. Look for, and you mentioned this earlier, Kirk, look for things that teen loves, whether it's music or mechanical stuff or coffee or poetry, and meet that teen where they're at, because all teens need adults that are not their parents in their life. Because I'm seven, my daughter, my last one at home is 17, and I can say something 6 times. And my coworker, who is also a youth leader, can say the exact same thing. And my daughter, KJ, will come home and go, "Mom, Shane told me, da, 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 da." And I'll be like, "Hello." Right? Yeah. Speak into their life, walk along the journey with them, stand with them, build a relationship with them. It is essential for our kids to have adults outside of us, especially when your parents are the leaders. They need some other people to come alongside them and build them up and build that relationship with them.
Yeah, and I'd like to encourage congregations, if they have a pastor with young children, which is that was the one that I was mentioning, was they had 4 young children, and they were a little overwhelmed, and the kids weren't well behaved. And after a year or so, the congregation said, "We can't handle it anymore. We need you to leave." And so, which is unfortunate. And then I've had pastors that have had teenagers that have kind of gone off the rails, and the one denomination I was in almost counted that as disqualification for the ministry. And then I have one who had a pastor who had a kid who was 22 who got into drugs and got on the street, and they wanted to disqualify that pastor for the choices of that kid. So it is a thing. And some of it is in those types of environments, there's a pressure on the children that is unfair. And so, like, whenever, I'll hear complaints sometimes, and it's always like, well, pray about what you can do to help the family. How can you help? How can you help this family? How can you create relationship with the parents so that the children can find someone else that's trusted to, that you could speak into their life. If all you're doing is telling them quit running or stop doing this, but you don't have a relationship with them, it's not going to go well, and then you're just going to be frustrated. So no, I appreciate that insight. I think, especially with teens today, we could spend a whole series of podcasts on that, but we won't. But it's tough. You always want to say, oh, they have it, so much harder. The temptations are all the same. It's just we have access to temptations in a way that we didn't have in the past, and so it's a little more in our face. And so, but I'd like to circle back to just kind of the main emphasis as we close this up for your ministry, and that's about how do we rest. And so I would like to hear some strategies, some more strategies, and I know you have more, and maybe unpack those four a little bit more. We talked about solitude quite a bit, but what are some strategies for pastors, church workers, their spouses, and the family? And then even the churches and in the congregation to truly taking Sabbath rest.
Yeah. Sabbath rest is it's essential. Taking Sabbath seriously is life-giving, and it equips us to be sustainable long-term for what God has called us to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sabbath needs to be honored. It needs to be set apart. It needs to be seen as special. It needs to be seen as important. And in our culture, we don't value any of that, right? We don't value any kind of rest. We value accomplishment and achievement and money, right? Mm-hmm. And so taking Sabbath seriously is one of the best things we as believers can do, especially for pastors who pour out their life every day. They need a chance for the Lord to fill them back up. So I mentioned this earlier. I want to give just some really functional ways. So number one is, if you're not taking a Sabbath, start with just 3 hours. Talk to if you're married, you have kids, talk to your family about, hey guys, Sabbath is a commandment. I'm a bottom line person. And when I think of Sabbath, I think, okay, it's a commandment. And if you look at Jesus's life, he made stillness and walking away from crowds of people with needs. He lived a life where he did that again and again, right? And so take it seriously, and take it seriously as a family, and go to your family and just say, hey, I've realized we're not doing this great, and we need to start this journey, right? There's not a lot of specifics in the word about how do I spend the Sabbath, right? But in Exodus 12, it says this: 6 days do your work, but on the seventh day do not work. And it goes on to talk about ox and donkeys and those that are slaves. But then the end of it says, take the Sabbath so you will be refreshed, right? So you will be refreshed. So the question I have for you, and that I would ask the pastors, is what refreshes you? And honestly, when I was first asked this question 10 years ago, I was like, I don't know. I'm really good at achieving. I'm really good at overcoming obstacles, but I don't know what refreshes me. And so begin to identify the things that refresh you. So what people fill you up, right? We all have people who suck us dry. Don't spend time with those people on the Sabbath, okay? Yeah. Identify who makes you feel your best, who reminds you of who you are and what God has called you to do, okay? The second one is, what places do you feel safe and free? For me, it's my home, it's the lake, and it's our sanctuary, right? And then the last one, so what people fill you up, what places, and the last one is what pastimes. What fun things, you talked about this, Kirk, do you do that make you feel alive? Whether it's tennis or hiking or crafting or whatever it might be, right? And then during Sabbath, there's kind of 3 things we talk about focusing on. Focus on connecting with the Lord. Focus on connecting with what's going on inside, and then focusing on connecting with others, those that are most important to you, right? We often talk about at Run Hard, Rest Well that people who are closest to you spell love, T-I-M-E, time with them. So connecting with God. How do you connect with the Lord most? What sets your heart on fire for him? Is it time in the Word? Is it worship? Is it being in nature? Taking a passage of scripture and talking about it with a friend? Playing an instrument? For a lot of my creative folks, like making music and praising God that way is really connects them. Maybe it's listening to scripture. That's one of the things I've gotten into recently, is actually listening to it instead of reading it. So how do you connect with the Lord most? Do that. Number 2 is connect with what's going on inside. And that sounds kind of like a little cheesy, but the reality is we live such a fast-paced life where we go, 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 and then crash in front of technology that we don't have any space to really think about what's going on inside. And the reality is we have feelings that need to be expressed. And that's not a bad thing, whether you're a male or a female. If you look at David and the Psalms, he laid it all out.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so how can you kind of look within? Maybe it's journaling. Maybe it's kind of asking and just taking 20 minutes and going, what's the best thing that happened this week? What's the hardest thing that happened this week? And just kind of process through that. Taking a drive, I have a lot of people, including myself, if I get behind a car, I turn off the music and I just let my mind drift. It's just really helpful to me. It gives me space to process. Being intentional to kind of see what's going on inside. And then the third one is connecting with others. Being intentional to connect with those closest to you. So I was speaking to some pastors' spouses, and I had a woman come up to me in tears. And she said, Stacey, I have 3 small children, and we're new to this church. And so I don't know who is safe that I can leave my kids with. But I desperately need a break. I need to do this Sabbath thing weekly. How do I do it? And so we kind of make this plan. So after church, the pastor was male. Your husband takes the kids for 2 hours. He takes them home. He gives them their snack. He puts them down for nap. And then you get those 2 hours to do whatever you want. And then you come home and your husband gets those 2 hours and you go. And then after those 4 hours, you've had 2 hours of refreshment. He's had 2 hours of refreshment. Come home and then do something fun as a family. And I have given that advice to so many families that feel like they don't have someone they can give their kids to. If you have someone that you know is safe at the church, ask for help. Say, hey, one Sunday a month, would you take my kids for 4 hours so we can go out and have dinner and just enjoy being together? Most people will jump at the chance to come alongside the pastor and their spouse and help them in that way, right? And then when connecting with others, play. You talked about this, Kirk. It's so important that we play. We go play baseball in the backyard. We go swimming. We go hiking. We color together. We recreate together. Whatever it might be that really connects your family, be intentional, because how often in our lives do we go from work to extracurricular activity and we just keep going and we never have time to really have fun together, right? Bottom line is be intentional about how you spend your Sabbath.
Well, what I like about what you said is I think often there's just, even as pastors and church leaders, I think we don't understand Sabbath. And so we think Sabbath is, oh, I just got to go for, and, we take it as a whole day that I just got to be, doing nothing. And I find that that doesn't fill me up. My wife has Fridays, and she only works Monday through Thursday, and I like to be here on Mondays, and so we decided 2 years ago, let's make sure that either Friday or Saturday we don't go into the church at all. Because, we would go, and she was doing children's ministry, so we would go for 4 hours on one of the, and then I would always say, well, I got to go check this. I got to go do this. And even if it was like a half hour, I'm still going to the office to do something. And we found that just having that day where we're not, driven to do something at the church was really beneficial to us. And we had a great time hanging out together, even if we were doing nothing really. But it wasn't like, oh, I got to go get this accomplished before I can, so just little things like that are really important. And I would like to speak briefly, if you wouldn't mind me. There are denominations that I agree with this in theological concept, that Jesus spoke that, well, he's your Sabbath rest. And so you can have rest all the time. So that gives us an excuse not to actually take physical rest. And I find that is problematic. We were made to enjoy life a whole lot more than we do. And I think when we get to heaven and in glory, we're going to be like, oh man, we could have had a lot more fun. Unfortunately, I think he's going to change us. So we're not going to be so focused on his abilities, but, Yeah, so if someone wanted to get in contact with you or what you do, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah. So if they go to runhardrestwell.org,
Mhm.
and there's a little button that just talks about contacting us, and that goes to me personally.
Okay.
And man, I would love to talk with you about how we can partner with you, your staff, your congregation, and if you have a school connected to you, your school. We have 1 to 3 hour seminars and retreats, half day and whole day. And one of the things that we hear again and again is that we are very high energy, we're very interactive. We really give a lot of space for people to process and connect, because that is where learning happens,
Mhm.
right? We use fun brain science experiments, and we also, whenever you have a seminar or retreat with us, we actually give you a 3-month follow-up package. So we never want to be a one and done, right? We want this to really dig in, to change lives. And so we give this resource where they can continue to work on restorative wellness together for 3 months. And so that's always comes with everything we do.
Wow. Good stuff. Thanks so much, Stacey. Just enjoy what you're doing, enjoy your heart for it, your authenticity, which is wonderful. And again, if you like this, please like, share, and subscribe. And together we can build one another up in love and help the church flourish and rest. So thanks, Stacey.
Thank you.